Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Clara Mattei in today's episode. She is a professor of economics and director of the Center for Heterodox Economics at the University of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her highly claimed book, The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism, has very recently been released in German by the Brumaire Verlag under the title Die Ordnung des Kapitals, Wie Ökonomen die Autorität erfanden und dem Faschismus den Weg bereiteten. And I had the absolute pleasure of welcoming Clara in my podcast studio in Vienna when she was in town as part of her book tour for the German release. And you will find the English and German version of the book in the show notes. Plus, and this is something I want to highlight specifically, you will also find a link to the Center for Heterodox Economics that Clara has created in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and where many exciting things are happening. It's a place that wants to bring together theory and practice, and that strives to rethink and redo economics. So please check out their website and program, and if you can, join in and take part in their absolutely wonderful events. Before we start, I want to welcome Julia as a patron of Future Histories, and I want to thank Karl, Valentin, Marie-Therese, Fate, Alexander, Ralf, Henry, Lukas, Wilfried, and Fabian for their kind donations. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Clara Mattei on austerity, fascism, and authoritarian liberalism. Welcome, Clara.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Clara, I have to say it is simply insane how timely your book is. But before we get to talk about the incredible and honestly quite horrifying comeback of austerity politics, let's start with your definition of austerity. You write about an austerity trinity in the form of fiscal austerity, monetary austerity, and industrial austerity. What are these different elements of austerity and how do they relate to each other?
Thank you so much. I think historical research can really shed light on how often in contemporary debates and today, we understand concepts in a way that are functional to preserving the status quo. Our understanding of austerity is deeply flawed because it plays in the interests of those who actually want to conceal what austerity really is. When we read the definition of austerity normally, we hear it is about budget cuts and tax increases. Now, this definition tells you absolutely nothing about what austerity is actually doing, which is really about shifting resources from the many, the workers, to the few, those who live off of capital gains, so dividends and interests. So here is really the point, is that austerity is not about less state, more market. It's not about the state retrieving and letting the market be. Quite to the contrary, the whole point here is to stress how the very market requires austerity as the protector of the fundamental social relation that governs our economy, which is based on the fact that the majority has no alternative but to go work for a wage. And you need to impose this actively. And this is what austerity does. So the Trinity actually operates in unison to achieve greater protection of what I call the capital order. And again, capital order is to stress the political dimension of our economy that economists usually just completely forget about or try to conceal. So we have fiscal austerity. Again, it's not about budget cuts and tax increases. It's about specifically cuts in social expenditures, housing, school, unemployment benefits, health, of course, right now we're seeing the extreme of this in the Trump administration. But again, this is not an exception. It's quite the norm, I would say, under a capitalist society, while you subsidize and de-risk and fund private investors, right? So the fact that actually today, like the United States, also Europe is planning to rearm is not in contradiction to the logic of austerity. It actually plays in the logic of keeping the resources in the hand of the large corporations and the asset managers that ultimately decide for all of us where it is profitable to invest. Fiscal austerity is not just about where the state spends, but also who the state taxes. And here, again, it's about regressive taxation. It's the state taxing workers and families more than capital. So we see this clearly when consumption taxes go up, when income brackets get reduced, so that actually the wealthy pay less taxes, and especially when the profit taxes on profit, inheritance are just constantly shrunk. In the United States, for example, capital is taxed much less than labor. So if you make an income off of capital, you basically do not pay taxes, while workers get their taxes detracted directly from their paychecks. This is fiscal austerity, going hand in hand usually, and I mean, it's not a fixed rule, but usually historically what you see is that it's combined also with monetary austerity. So moments of dear money, I think we clearly know what it is because we've seen it in the last couple of years. When interest rates go up, this is not just a neutral measure to fix inflation, as it is in a way proposed to us. Actually, what is fixing is the rate of exploitation, because once more, it has an impact on the labor market because it increases unemployment. It makes the labor market worse for workers. And this means that workers will be willing to accept worse working condition and anyway a subjugation to the only way of making a living. And this is important. These fiscal and monetary measures have an indirect but very clear impact on labor relations. And this is, sorry, I forgot to say, this is very clear also for the fiscal side of the Trinity, because if you have less rights, less access to rights like schooling and housing and healthcare, of course, you will need to buy these rights. Once these rights are commodified, then of course you are more market dependent, and this is the very purpose of austerity. So finally, we have industrial austerity, or what I call industrial austerity, which is when the state directly intervenes in the labor market to weaken workers through privatizations, through labor deregulation. In Europe, we've seen this over and over again, how work has become more and more precarious. The United States, is at the peak of this. People actually cannot work more than a certain amount of hours so that the corporations keeps you without benefits. Just the other day, I walked into a Dollar Tree in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I gave a flyer of our event for our center to the cashier. She looks at me. The flyer was on the housing crisis, and she tells me, I'm homeless. I make $9 an hour, and I can only work up to 19 hours a week. And this is, again, because like this, you avoid having full-time employees. So this on-call contracts, the fact that actually it's the worker who takes on the risk of the business, is something that is like, a very obvious symptom of what austerity brings, industrial austerity brings to. So this trinity, I think you see develop historically in many different forms, of course. And what I do in the book is trace one of the moments in which it emerges very clearly after the First World War.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I mean, that's an interesting bridge, because to a certain extent, at least to me, it seemed as if it is emerging quite clearly right now again. So maybe let's talk about the political shifts that we are witnessing today and their relation to austerity. You just mentioned the fact that a raise in defense spending is actually not in contradiction to austerity. And I immediately had to think about our new Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who just recently announced that in German it was Die Zeiten des Paradieses, wo jeder Wunsch möglich ist, sind vorbei, which translates to the times of paradise where every wish is possible are over, which is of course pretty hilarious, as if the wishes of the populace had been fulfilled before. And he said that in a moment where at the same time they created a so-called Sondervermögen, which is actually a extra budget outside of the normal national budget, a Sondervermögen for defense spending. So this goes absolutely in parallel, and it doesn't seem to be a contradiction for Friedrich Merz as well. And of course, in the US, we have Donald Trump, who is saying that his policies may cause short-term pain, but will produce big gains over time. And there is, of course, also an absolutely unprecedented gutting of social expenditure and a general remaking of the state underway through DOGE. Now, your book is about the relation between austerity and fascism. I guess it's fair to say that austerity is having a pretty massive comeback, as is fascism. So what do you make of our present moment?
You raised so many interesting points. The first point I want to mention is that it's actually Biden, so a democratic government, that produced what is ultimately a record in the American history, military spending. So actually it got to $916 billion in 2024. And again, we know that this has meant really the funding of the massacre of the entire Palestinian population that is still, again, going on this week, unfortunately, with over 800 people killed, most of them children. So again, we see how the logic of profit, which is the logic that austerity is functional to, is very much in contradiction to the logic of need. And what Trump is just doing is revealing in a more naked and clear way this oppressive function of austerity that, you know, the Democratic Party tries to hide beneath, for example, the excuse of financial deficit or a need to, you know, tighten our belts because the debt is too high. It's not even about the debt anymore. This is what is very interesting, is that the conversation has actually revealed itself to be really what it is all about, which is a one-sided class warfare against workers and the poor. So what to say? I think what is interesting is that the fact that all of a sudden in Europe, one is willing to, you know, forego the deficit rules in order to rearm, again points the finger to the revelation of how political these decisions about spending are, and how actually the idea of fixing certain rules together with fixing certain independent institutions like the independent central bank are historical maneuvers to fundamentally depoliticize economics to make it sound as if, you know, these experts are only following certain scripts that are necessary, objective, and universal. And actually what is happening today is that this political dimension is more than ever clear. And I think it's the reason why we really need urgently to rethink the definition of austerity so that people can call our governments out in the absurdity of the moment. It's also very interesting that you read that quote about the sacrifice, because this is the usual script that is at least 100 years old. In the book, I tell the story of the Brussels and Genoa conferences. These are the first international conferences that were put together right after this First World War in 1920 and 1922 with the idea of fixing the economic crisis. And the economic crisis was basically the fact that workers and people at large were demanding a different type of economy and putting it into practice. And so these experts are really saying, you know, there's lines in the formal records of the conference that really say people don't understand the hard truth that the only way is live hard, save hard, work hard. Really, the topic of the sacrifice that emerges in forms of consume less, produce more as the mantra to fix our economy, like today, reveals its violent face. What they're really saying is the workers have to sacrifice in the name of the investors' profits. And I think the way in which actually austerity has been able to disguise itself as like good economics, as prudent economics, speaks to the intelligence of our economic system, our capitalist economic system, in reproducing itself and maintaining itself protected. But I do think that right now it is the moment in which narratives that try to get to the deep reality of things can be more clearly understood just because of these very, very acceleration of the austerity you were pointing to.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the US Democrats, they are screamingly silent in all of this, I would say. Again, a similarity from your book comes into mind with regard to the way Italian liberals in the early 20th century played a crucial role in paving the way for fascism by promoting policies that undermined democratic and socialist alternatives. You already pointed in this direction. Would you say, or do you think that liberals in the US are not putting up a fight against the second Trump administration and DOGE because they actually sympathize with the austerity measures that they are enacting?
Completely. I mean, the farce, deep down, I think that the horrible nature of Trump's government at least stops the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party. I mean, under Biden, child poverty rates in the United States more than doubled in just 2 years. And it's now 1 child out of 7 who is in deep poverty. In New York City, the city where I lived for a long time before moving to Oklahoma, we have 1 child out of 8 in public schools who is homeless. And this is more than 140,000 children who are homeless in the wealthiest city in the world, the city that has the greatest concentration of wealth. So these are the type of contradictions that were produced, by the long-run austerity of the Democratic Party. And I do think that what we see is definitely what in my book I try to show, which is the parallel between what are economic policies specific to fascism, meaning austerity. And this is very important because actually we learn wrongly when we have our school books about history that somehow fascism is not capitalism. The way the story is recounted makes you think that fascism is something like corporativism or something else, which really hides the fact that fascism in Benito Mussolini's regime, so the founding father of fascism, was the most violent form of austerity policies, which is the reason why then the liberal establishment, and this is the story I tell in the book also, really, really enjoyed him in power. So what you see is that people that then recycled themselves as anti-fascist, like Luigi Einaudi, who becomes in Italy the first president of the Republic after the fall of the regime, was actually for the whole of the 1920s writing how great economic policies under Mussolini were because of his capacity to implement the Trinity. Mussolini did the largest scale privatization in the West in that moment. He laid off 75,000 employees in just one go. He eliminated unions, eliminated the right to strike. He slashed social expenditures and increased the value of the lira. And this is all things that not only the domestic liberals, but also the international elite, like the Brits, for example, adored. So I think, again, we see the parallelism. Ultimately, what Trump is doing is something that the Democrats, the liberal Democrats, have no real issue with, but they're glad someone else is doing it instead of them. And this is a very similar story you see with the reason why I think there's a good historical evidence to say that Mussolini would not have stayed in power for so long if he hadn't gained the complete applause from the liberal elite, who was willing to sacrifice political freedom and who was well aware of the fact that actually political opposition was being beaten and killed in jail. Actually, side note, the book is dedicated to Gianfranco Mattei, who is my great uncle, who actually killed himself in a torture prison during the Nazi fascist occupation in 1944. He was building bombs to oppose the occupation. He got caught, tortured, and he decided to kill himself rather than speak out against his comrades. So, it was no joke, but this was in a way a trade-off that was acceptable then and has been acceptable many other times in the history of capitalism, with Pinochet, for example, with even with Boris Yeltsin in Russia, many other cases in which clearly, like Montagu Norman says about Mussolini, he was the right man at a critical moment. This is a letter he writes. I found it in the archives. He said he was the right man at a critical moment so that the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the opposite direction. So the risk was we had to protect the capital order, and this is what matters first. Then comes all the rest.
basically you're already clearly stating that when push comes to shove, liberalism will basically always side with capital, even if it means siding with authoritarianism.
Yes.
Would you say that it is a fair assessment to say that any form of political liberalism is basically incoherent if it does not also advocate for democracy in the sphere that we commonly call, quote unquote, the economy?
Absolutely. And I think this is really how fascinating it is to find out how liberalism was able to appropriate the word freedom, because what emerged clearly, and again, it emerges many times in history, but I think in a very, very obvious way after the First World War, is that the majority of citizens who had lived through the First World War had seen the level of repression that was political at that point, because the state had to intervene to militarize the workforce in order to produce efficiently enough to win the conflict. Well, in that historical moment, it was clear in which capitalism was incompatible with economic freedom. And this was clear. And what's interesting, I think, about the evidence that I bring in the first part of the book is that it wasn't just, the militant workers and with Antonio Gramsci, who I dedicate a chapter to, chapter 4, in which they were advocating for assemblies and self-organized workers. And I know you talk about this a lot in your own podcast very much. It was also the bourgeoisie who was realizing that the system was just anachronistic and ultimately incapable of appeasing the population who had gained economic agency. So it's very interesting to me how it is clear that in moments in which everyone realizes that our economy is incompatible with the fundamental economic freedom, given that, again, this is how it structurally operates. In order to have economic growth under capitalism, in order to have what everyone thinks is great, which is GDP growth, right? A measurable entity to show how productive and productive we are. This is based on exploitation, in the technical sense that the workers are paid less than what the value they produce, and that they have no say in what is being produced. And again, this is not just a matter of how much you get paid. I think the Google engineer working in New York and wanting to oppose the fact that Google was signing billionaire contracts with the Israeli military just last year had to either resign or he would get fired if he did not accept to work for the objective that the corporation had set for him. So this is the general unfreedom of the labor relation, again, capital as a social relation, that makes it such that liberalism is quite contradictory, because it is based on a fundamental freedom, and the fact that it has appropriated the concept of freedom to itself is what is ultimately very intelligent. And I would end by saying that in my work, what I focus on is how economic theory helps in this direction, right? So the liberalism as a political ideology ultimately rests and takes a lot from economic models that portray capitalism. They don't even talk about capitalism anymore, we know, portray this market, this idealized institution, as the realm in which the most virtuous can actually freely operate for the benefit of everyone else. So the big shift from the labor theory of value that was actually energizing workers for a long time, and especially after the First World War, in which it was clear that the worker was at the center of the economic machine. It was thanks to the worker that things happened, but the worker had no freedom. We go to a model that tells you there are no workers really that matter. There are no classes. All that it is individuals working in harmony. There's no conflict, and that the worker is really dependent, and so should be thankful to the saver investor, who is the one who can hire the workers in the first place. And this is a big, big shift in the way we think about the world that ultimately plays into the liberal ideology, but it is a very classist shift that is, of course, hidden through pure economics, through the idea that actually finally economics becomes a science and is no longer political. But really what is happening here is to say profits are not the unjust, basically, theft of labor time. What is happening here is that profits are the fair remuneration for the productivity of capital in the production function. And so the mathematization of this today, when students study economics, they don't see it, but it's there. It's in those models that students learn and then apply. There's a whole array of classist assumptions that after the First World War were clearly, obviously meant to defeat the working classes. And so this is a little bit of what I study in the book, is how these economists were playing into Mussolini's government. They were actually in Mussolini's government himself, wanting to stop workers from organizing and using their pure economics as a way to say, well, we are just telling you the truth of things. We're not in any way participating. We just know what is best for you, and we know you just have to be subordinate to the capital order.
Yeah, and I mean, very unfortunately, they were quite successful in the whole process. So austerity was really a success story, not in terms of the metrics that they themselves say are relevant, but in regard to the metric of basically crushing labor power. So if austerity is, in essence, class war from above, how can we succeed in this fight if the other side is basically willing to use any means necessary to prevent class power from emerging, including cutting the absolutely basic security nets and inflicting pain on the whole economy and workers specifically, which of course means that those who don't have any savings will have absolutely no room to navigate. I mean, this is an incredibly difficult position for fighting back, since the material basis of everyday life becomes more and more precarious. Plus, I have to add, since liberals are basically not part of the resistance, the left also has to do their job of defending fundamental achievements of parliamentary democracy. So how can all of this be done without falling into defensive struggles alone, but instead keep advancing a vision that is committed to the struggle for a society free from capitalist domination?
That's the $100 million question that I think we're all trying to answer. I think, I guess, what I can contribute to this very difficult question is how actually, again, historical work can be very empowering when it serves to demystify and really reveal certain patterns, certain tendencies, and these long tendencies. And again, austerity is not the product of neoliberalism. I think this is a very important lesson that we need to keep in order to fight in a more empowering way. You know, it's not enough to just say, well, can revert back to the golden years of capitalism. No, austerity is actually deeply in the DNA of the system, because there's a fundamental issue that I think austerity brings to light. And again, as you point out, austerity has nothing to do with balancing the budget, and it's rarely successful. And I think all Keynesian economists have shown this, how austerity rarely produces the effects it's supposed to in terms of actually curing our deficit problem. But what I try to say that Keynesians don't really see is that that's not really the purpose of austerity. Again, austerity is not just a rational policy. It is very successful, but successful, as you were pointing out, through another criteria, which is the criteria of the class struggle that Keynesians don't really see, because they take capitalism for granted as the only possible system, just as much as their supposed opponents. And so this is really important. And the liberatory message here is actually that austerity is in the DNA of capitalism, again, not a product of neoliberalism, something much, much deeper. And this is because fundamentally, there is a contradiction and a conflict between redistribution of resources and the capital order. And I think this is very clear. You cannot give people resources because this is risky politically. You cannot have full employment because this is risky politically. In what sense is it risky politically? In the sense that it risks shaking the pillar of capital, the relation of production, the wage labor, the fact that people realize that it's possible that there is another way to make a living that is not by selling one's capacity to work for a wage and losing all freedom and agency in this process. And so moments in which social redistribution does happen is very dangerous for the stability, the political stability of our economy. And again, this political stability is not to be taken for granted. And this, I think, is the emancipatory message, is there's nothing spontaneous and natural in it. It is actually something that has to be constantly, actively enforced and reinforced. And so here, if we realize that there's nothing spontaneous of the market, that actually the market is an illusion and the social relations grounding it are actually protected by political intervention. The state is always intervening under capitalism, but it is intervening again in a way that disempowers workers. And so I think the lesson here is, one, that the system is more fragile than we think because it actually requires constant protection. And it's something that we see how actively this has to be enforced. The Fed, 2 years ago, when it started increasing interest rate in the United States, it did it really out of fear. I mean, there's the models, even the neoclassical models ultimately tell you that unemployment is a necessary disciplinary mechanism to avoid the labor market from being not smooth enough and not functional to investment. So in a moment in which workers in the United States, in a country that has disempowered its people for so long through structural austerity, still people with the pandemic saw a possibility of having some money that was not earned through wages, just a little bit of money given from the state. Well, people resigned from their jobs. I want to remind everyone, it was almost 50 million workers who resigned. So that's 30% of the labor force. It's a huge number. Unions were propping up, new unions, strikes were being won. All these experts at this Fed were saying, you know what? Inflation is the fault of these guys because the labor market is too tight. And what you mean by the labor market being too tight is a technical word to say workers are having it too nice for them. And there's a dosage of sacrifice that needs to be imposed. And again, it's not the evilness of Jerome Powell or whoever in government. The point is that these institutions have a function, and the primary function of managing the economy is not technical, it's political. How do you manage a capitalist economy? Well, you make sure that people do go to work the next day so that investors can keep accumulating. Otherwise, there is no economic growth. And this is a problem for our economic system, not necessarily for people, but for our economic system, absolutely. So I think this is really interesting, is to say, well, you know what, actually, we could think about alternatives given that the system is actually quite fragile. And I think this is something that could help mobilize people also in realizing, of course, the non-eternity of capitalism, which is something that we so often take for granted. I want to end by saying capitalism has been around for only 0.1% of the time Homo sapiens has been on the planet, at least industrial capitalism. This is very little time, and the destructive force of this economy is under everyone's eyes right now, both in terms, of course, of the climate devastation, the genocides, and everything we're seeing. This is not disconnected from our economic system.
Speaking of alternatives, within the debate about democratic economic planning, a very popular approach is to call for the democratization of investment. I mean, one could say that austerity is basically also a form of using the power over investment to stabilize the capitalist system to a certain extent, I guess. Mm-hmm. So democratizing the investment function would basically be very, very important for any alternative to capitalism, mm-hmm. I guess, which means, of course, to abolish the capitalist's control over investment and instead have democratic planning of investment along social and ecological needs. What would you say are good instruments and transformational projects to pursue in order to push for and experiment with the democratization of investment?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I'm sure you're much more knowledgeable than me about all these topics. What I can say is that we can learn from specific historical episodes, I think, and rather than theorize in the abstract. What is important is to look at concrete examples and see the strengths and weaknesses of these examples. So again, the example I studied in my book is all the ways in which worker self-management was actually born out of the First World War, and moments in which unions have betrayed workers in siding with the government to basically run policies that would make productivity greater, which meant work was more intense and also oppressive. And for example, in Britain, and it's interesting because one focus is usually on the Eastern Europe, but actually in Britain, the shop stewards in Scotland were organizing very sophisticated different levels of assemblies that started from the level of the workshop and actually grew at the level of the industry in industries that were similar to each other, and even at the level of the neighborhood. So really kind of a federation of councils that were experimented with also in Britain, and of course in Italy, through also the idea of the possible linkages between the peasants and their occupation of the countryside in Italy. That was very big, and the assemblies there and the factory councils. So I think there's a lot to learn there. Also a lot to learn about, the difficulty of starting from a micro level, of course, and how to develop actually a political force. And of course, then the theoretical debates emerge about but I think what Gramsci really showed, and I think this is important, is that there is no separation between the economic and the political. The very political organization emerges because of these reorganization in the decision-making at the level of the economy, in the sense of the decision-making about investment. So if you politicize the decisions about investment, this is already creating political institutions that can become the embryo of a new state that is not alienated from people like the capitalist state, but actually representing the urges and the needs of people. Right now, I think there are still a lot, and again, you cover many, but for the one that most inspired me personally has been the MST movement, where I got a chance to meet directly some organizers. It's the movement of landless workers in Brazil, and they actually have a very sophisticated, again, understanding of what democratic processes for investment are, and it is all based on recallable representatives, and how actually, again, you can start little, and then in federations and assembly you can have representatives though that are recallable, in the sense that they can't just do what they want, they have to be in some way connected with the base. And that's why ultimately this comes out with very impressive experiments of constitutional systems. Again, how the economic reorganization means a political organization, that it ultimately means a different constitution. There's not the liberal constitution that usually is meant to detach people from the representatives, but the opposite. So I think these are just some examples, of course, that then have to deal with the usual fact that then they are still within a capitalist economy. But they show how, again, austerity can and is the instrument to avoid these experiments from being known and, of course, spreading.
This is kind of a very different level from the examples that you just gave, but central banks play a quite crucial role in your story as well. And people like Benjamin Brown or Daniela Gabor, they argue for the possibility of a democratization of central banks and the function that they play as well. Would you say that there is a potential in democratizing central banks?
Well, absolutely. And I think the first step is to point out how anti-democratic they are. And again, I think the parallel between the two cases I show in the book, which is actually how in the British case, austerity was basically enforced through central banks who were being fought for as independent in a moment in which the gold standard had collapsed. When the gold standard collapsed, it was very clear that there was no natural rule by which countries had to deflate every time the value of their currency was low because of the fear of the loss of gold, right? So this whole fact that monetary austerity before the war was ingrained in the system because it was just a rule of global markets had fallen. And so in this moment, actually, the non-orthodox monetary policies, and especially the idea that you could just print money to give resources to people, were being experimented with, and the Labour Party was calling for the nationalization of the Bank of England. In this moment, many experts were actually fighting against this possibility. Ralph Hotchie, one of the protagonists of my book, he was the in-house economist at the British Treasury, said very clearly, central banks should never explain, never regret, never apologize. And this is exactly what central banks are meant to do. The ECB is the most independent central bank in the world. And what independence means is not independence from ideologies or class bias, but independent from political organizations. So the fact that really the idea is leave it all in the hands of the experts. And many people could think this is a good idea because you think, well, the experts have a PhD, they must know how to run this machine that is the economy. But then if you're lucky enough to, like myself, study economics without, though, giving into just the technicalities, and you find out that they're models to assess the reasons for inflation are telling you that the reason inflation even comes up is because people are misbehaving, because the labor costs are too high or people are consuming too much, right? This is actually the idea that the demand is too high, which means what? That people might have more in their pockets and then might be wanting to, purchase more than they usually do. These models basically tell you that inflation is resolved through unemployment. And of course, this is the Phillips curve. It's actually modeled, the unemployment and inflation, they're in relation with each other. The more inflation is high, the more unemployment is low. So this is where we need to rethink the reason why it's not the evil central bankers in power that are the problem, but the fact that these economic models that they use reinforce the capital order. And again, central bank independence has been fought actively to be achieved, to the point that in my story, I show how that worked in Britain very well in killing all of these experiments. As soon as the central bank increased interest rates by 7% in April 1920, the unemployment rate went up, and you see the data shows you that the unionization rates and strike intensity completely collapsed. And so the industrial peace was finally achieved, which was the real goal. In the meantime, Mussolini was doing the same, just with more industrial austerity. But again, different means to achieve the same end. And so I think the parallels of the story expose the anti-democratic nature of the institutions that we define as technical today. So I think definitely this is important, is to say, well, the political battle is also at the level of these institutions. I don't think these institutions will change because a couple of intellectuals say they should change. I think they will change only through political pressure from below. And the first step to get that political pressure is to really reveal and denounce what these institutions stand for. It has nothing to do, again, with targeting inflation. They're targeting the rate of exploitation. And this is just a reality that people need to know in order to figure out how to democratize central banks.
Your book is called The Capital Order, and I really, really like that you aim at understanding an underlying structural logic. Now, if we think about desirable alternatives to capitalism, what would be a desirable underlying ordering principle, or maybe principles of these alternatives? Or maybe asked differently, what would a book titled The Socialist Order be about?
Yeah, again, big questions. I think the term economic democracy is a term that could be used to avoid also, the fact that many people are alienated by the term socialist or communist. And again, this speaks to the success of the austerity narrative that wants us all to believe that actually the best we can do is all to resemble the Homo economicus that maximizes his profits, right? And that anything else ultimately is somehow not in tune with who we really are as human beings. So I think economic democracy, I think, is a term that can unite people that ultimately are all workers, but they don't understand themselves as workers necessarily. And that's, again, a very big success of austerity, is how we've lost awareness of the fact that we are workers, even if we don't, share the exact same condition as, of course, it was when the working class was more homogeneous. But the point is that the majority of us still does rely on wage labor. And of course, the real unity, I do think, is in the global south more than in places like Europe and the United States today. So I think that's the principles. Well, I don't think it's a blueprint that should hold. I think the idea is that different communities have different needs. Definitely what I can contribute to the debate is to say that the logic of need and the logic of profit are clearly in contradiction. And this is why, again, it's important to study austerity as an active means of enforcing a hierarchical economic system, because I don't think people realize, people feel the hardship on their skin and realize the contradiction of the system on their skin, but there are very few concepts that allow them to make sense of what is going on, right? Gramsci called this the contradictory common sense. Common sense understands the economy much better than the experts, actually, because it is the workers that ultimately live the economy. But then there is a lack of tools to really make sense of what you feel. And you end up then in this contradictory state by which you have internalized the narrative of those who dominate you. And you find this contradiction that then really frustrates many people, and then ends up, giving consent towards far-right governments that somehow play on this incapacity to build class awareness that we've clearly lost. So how to make a common sense less contradictory? That's where I guess the contribution of economic frameworks that are actually favorable to social change can play a role. So I would say that in my own work as an academic, I realize how academics are super responsible for the current situation of disempowerment and sense of lack of alternatives, because they ultimately enjoy their individual privilege and their removedness from society, and their, when you get famous, you get paid a lot of money to go around and give conferences, and that's basically all you aspire to in your life. These economists have no idea how the economy works, also because they don't live it. They have the most privileged positions, especially I'm talking about the United States. They're private employees with tenure, so it's almost like a non-existent status apart from very few prominent academics, in which they don't risk to get fired at all. They have a life tenure. They get a lot of benefits, live a very easy life. They don't even, like the CEOs, feel the pressure of the market. Someone like Elon Musk understands class conflict much better, because he knows he has to somehow deal with it in order to get rich. This is something that economists or academics in general don't need to deal with. So I think what I can say is that we need knowledge that is actually in dialogue with people. And again, this is not a new intuition. This is, again, something that Gramsci saw very well. I tried to describe it in chapter 4 of my book, is the concept of praxis, the idea that knowledge is only really capable of being transformative and empowering if it enhances and accelerates movements that are already in place. This is really important. Theory is completely empty without participation in the social struggles. And the only theory that is not bourgeois theory is theory that is able to, through concepts that empower, accelerate energies that are already on the ground, right? So that's why the energy doesn't come from the academic. It comes from people who organize in solidarity. But at the same time, the solidarity economy, I think, can benefit from a systemic understanding of how capitalism operates, right? So the systemic understanding, again, contradictory common sense, you think it's just like an exceptional case, your boss is mean, or like, there's like just some corruption going on or some monopolistic power that is the problem. No. That's the neoclassical framework that tends to tell you that anything that is bad is kind of an exception from the norm. It's the opposite. Actually, these are the expression of the norm, but we need to systematize it so that we understand what the norm looks like. And that's the role, I think, of critical economists, or we can say heterodox economists. And that's why my center, the CE, that I direct, we just opened 3 months ago, is trying to do exactly this, is trying to say, how do we bring knowledge to people without the top-down approach, the idea that the knowledge that I'm trying to build, which is, again, the systemic approach to how our capitalist system operates, can be in dialogue with the lived experiences and with the organizations. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a red state, a place that is suffering from the deepest contradictions of capitalism, poverty rates are enormous. There's homelessness everywhere. People are toothless in the street because they can't afford to just go to the dentist. So it's very visible in Tulsa, Oklahoma, how really capitalism dehumanizes people. There are a lot of solidarity economy experiments, a lot. And they exist. They're at the margins, and they're spontaneous. So the point is, how do you make the spontaneity connected and also capable of relating what they're doing with the larger picture of how capitalism operates and how it can be changed. So I guess that's I don't know if I answered your question, but I would say that this is what I see I can contribute to, is to build an institution that leaves some space for people to feel empowered and be creative about this.
Wonderful. I really love it. How can people, if they want to take part in this experiment that is the Center for Heterodox Economics at the University of Tulsa, Oklahoma, if people want to take part, is there a possibility to do so?
Yes. You don't have to move to Tulsa. I mean, it would be great. Actually, what's interesting about the CHE, the Center for Heterodox Economics, is that we're having public events. We had 2. We're having our 3rd on the housing crisis on April 5th. But these public events were very well participated from people because of an effort that works, which is incredible, of just flyering in the streets, speaking to people in the streets. You don't reach people just through social media, because you reach always the same people through social media. If you actually just go out there, public libraries, coffee shops, just stores, I hung the flyers in a liquor store, in a supermarket. This, or the polls. What's cool about, in Italy, you can't do this. I don't know about it here, but in the US, what's interesting is that there's all these light polls, and you can just actually hang without issues flyers. So a lot of this brought more than 150 people who are not academics in a room. And out of this already, there's already a group of 30 who we've been meeting once a week, to discuss the possibility of opening a community and worker center to, again, connect all of these struggles that are already there. And it's incredible fertile grounds. I'm surprised because in New York, it was much more difficult to organize people. So I would say you can come there for the full experience, but you can also, we have a website and a YouTube channel, and all our events are broadcasted there. And I think, the CHE is just one effort. There should be multiple efforts, I think, with similar intentions, but can also have a very different way of putting these intentions into action.
Absolutely wonderful. Clara, there's a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
That's a good question. I guess the fact that going to have a baby in 2 months. So that's the near future. I think children actually, I don't know, bring out the humanity and the spontaneous joy that I have a hard time keeping up, thinking about the long-term future, especially in this moment in which I think the barbarism of our economic system is just so evident. And again, I've been seriously having issues coping this year, in which we every single day children are being murdered and are suffering from thirst and hunger in Gaza. And again, it's not about just focusing on Gaza because one is obsessed about the Palestinian cause. The issue is that what's happening there is at a level of gravity in terms of blowing up hospitals, sewage systems, schools, killing teachers, doctors, abducting doctors, torturing them. The level of brutality there, I think, is really a mirror of what our economic system does and can do everywhere else in the world, right? I mean, ultimately, we can all be Palestinians. It's happening there. This means it can happen everywhere else, especially with the technology there is right now at this moment. So I think it is really, really important to realize how what is happening there is a lens that exposes how this is great for our economy. I mean, actually, you know, since 2023 October, the value of the market of so many corporations, directly or indirectly connected to this massacre, has grown. So once more, the logic of profit and the logic of need completely clashing. And sorry, it's very difficult, I think, to see something joyful in the future while this is going on. I hope the future is younger generations. Students have been standing up with huge consequences. In the United States right now, they're deporting en masse. All students have participated in solidarity campaigns. Every day you can read of one or two that have been deported and lose their visas and basically their careers and their future. But I think the joyfulness is in the fact that people are waking up, even notwithstanding the brainwashing that comes from the media and from our governments. And so I hope that future generations, including my children, will be strong enough to do something and to learn from historical work like the kind I produce, to kind of be more skeptical about the dominant narratives.
Clara, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.